The Nexus system floated in the dark space between stars. It had been watching the galaxy for millions of years. The ancient machine was bigger than most planets. Its job was simple: find new life and decide if it was dangerous. On this day, like every day for countless years, the Nexus turned its sensors toward a small yellow star. Around this star spun 8 planets. The third planet was blue and green. It had water and air and life. The Nexus had seen thousands of planets like this one. Most were boring. Some had simple animals. A few had smart creatures that could think and build things. This blue planet had both. The scanning beams reached down to the planet's surface. They moved across continents and oceans. They looked at forests and deserts. They studied the creatures that lived there. Most of the animals were normal. Fish swam in the seas. Birds flew in the sky. Large beasts walked on land. The Nexus had seen all these types before on other worlds, but there was something else. The sensors found groups of creatures that walked on 2 legs. They had no fur or scales. Their bodies looked weak and soft. They were small compared to the big animals around them. The Nexus focused its scans on these strange creatures. They called themselves humans. The machine studied how they lived and what they did. The humans lived in small groups. They built simple homes from mud and wood. They grew plants for food. They kept some animals to eat and use for work. When they fought each other, they used sharp sticks and stones. The Nexus compared this data to information about other species it had found. The humans fit a common pattern. They were young and weak. Their technology was basic. Their bodies could not do much. The machine began writing its report. New species found on planet designated Sol 3. Species name human. Body type: bipedal carbon-based. Height 1.5 to 2 meters. Weight 30 to 150 kilograms. Lifespan 60 to 80 local years. The Nexus continued its analysis. Humans could not fly like birds. They could not breathe underwater like fish. They could not run as fast as the 4-legged beasts. Their teeth were not sharp enough to tear meat easily. Their claws were too small and weak to climb or fight well. Physical capabilities limited. No natural weapons. No natural armor. Cannot survive in extreme heat or cold. Requires constant food and water. Body breaks easily when damaged. The machine tested the humans' intelligence. It watched them solve problems and make tools. They were smart enough to work together. They could plan for the future. They could learn new things and teach them to their children, but their brains were small. They could not think as fast as the crystal beings of Arcturus. They could not hold as much information as the hive minds of the Vega system. They forgot things often and made the same mistakes over and over. Mental capabilities: average. Limited memory storage, slow processing speed, prone to errors in judgment. Emotional responses interfere with logical thinking. The Nexus looked at human technology. They had discovered fire and could make simple tools. They used wheels to move heavy things. They built boats to cross water. Some groups had learned to work with metals. This was normal for a young species. The machine had seen it many times before. Every intelligent race started this way. Most took hundreds of thousands of years to develop space travel. Many never made it that far at all. Technology level: primitive. Basic tool use: simple agriculture. No advanced materials. No understanding of advanced physics. No space travel capability. The Nexus calculated how long it would take humans to become a threat to other species in the galaxy. The numbers were clear. At their current rate of progress, humans would need 50,000 years to leave their planet. They would need twice that long to travel between stars. By that time, the machine thought they would probably be extinct. Most species died out before they could reach space. Wars killed them. Diseases wiped them out. Their planets became too hot or too cold. Asteroids smashed into their worlds. The galaxy was a dangerous place for weak creatures. Threat assessment: none. Species unlikely to survive to spacefaring stage. If survival occurs, technological development too slow to pose danger to established civilizations. Classification: benign. The Nexus was satisfied with its report. Humans were just another ordinary species on another ordinary world. They might last a few thousand more years if they were lucky. Then they would join the millions of other failed species in the machine's memory banks. The great machine prepared to turn its attention elsewhere. There were more important things to watch. The Zephyrian Empire was building new warships. The Quantum Collective was experimenting with dangerous technology. The Voidwalkers were expanding into new sectors of space. But before the Nexus moved on completely, it followed standard protocol. It left a small part of itself to keep watching the humans. This monitoring program would check on them every few hundred years. It would record any major changes. If something unexpected happened, it would alert the main system. The Nexus did not expect the monitoring program to find anything interesting. Humans would probably follow the same path as every other primitive species. They would grow slowly. They would fight among themselves. Eventually, they would disappear. The monitoring program settled into its quiet watch. It observed the humans as they planted crops and raised animals. It watched them build bigger villages and learn new skills. It recorded their small wars and minor discoveries. Everything seemed normal and predictable. The humans had no idea they were being watched. They could not see the invisible sensors that studied their every move. They did not know that somewhere in space an ancient machine had decided they were not worth worrying about. They went about their daily lives. They were born, they lived, they died. Their children grew up and had children of their own. Generations passed like waves on the shore. The Nexus turned its mighty gaze toward other parts of the galaxy. It watched powerful empires rise and fall. It saw species that could reshape worlds with their thoughts. It observed beings that lived for millions of years and could travel faster than light. Compared to these mighty civilizations, humans were nothing. They were insects crawling on a small rock orbiting an average star. They were so unimportant that the Nexus forgot about them completely. The monitoring program continued its patient watch. Year after year, century after century, it collected data about the slow progress of humanity. The information went into storage files that no one looked at. Sometimes the program thought about sending an update to the main system. But there was never anything worth reporting. Humans were developing exactly as predicted. They were slow, weak, and ordinary. The program did not know that it was watching something unprecedented. It did not realize that these simple creatures would one day change everything the Nexus believed about life in the universe. For now, humans remained what they appeared to be. Harmless animals on a distant world, completely beneath the notice of the great powers that ruled the galaxy. The Nexus system had made its judgment. Humans were benign. They were safe to ignore. It was the biggest mistake the ancient machine had ever made. Time moved differently for the Nexus system. What seemed like long ages to humans passed like single heartbeats to the ancient machine. Hundreds of years went by while the Nexus focused on other parts of the galaxy. The monitoring program continued its quiet watch over the blue planet. It recorded human progress in neat data files. Most of the time, everything looked normal. Humans were growing slowly, just as expected. But small things began to seem strange. The program noticed that humans spread to places where they should not be able to live. Other species stayed in areas that felt comfortable and safe. They lived where the temperature was right and food was easy to find. When conditions became too hard, they moved away or died. Humans did something different. When they found a place that was too hot, they found ways to make it cooler. When they found a place that was too cold, they learned to make it warmer. Instead of running away from difficult places, they changed those places to suit them. The program watched humans build homes in frozen lands where no other creature could survive. It saw them create farms in deserts where nothing should grow. It observed them living on high mountains where the air was too thin for most animals to breathe. This was unusual but not impossible. Some species could adapt to harsh conditions. The program noted the information and continued watching. More time passed. The humans developed new tools and techniques faster than the program had predicted. They discovered how to work with better metals. They learned to build bigger and stronger structures. They created machines that could do work for them. The program checked its calculations. According to its models, humans should still be using simple stone tools. Instead, they were building complex devices in large cities. Their progress was happening much faster than it should. The program sent a small update to the Nexus system. Human development exceeding projected timeline. Technology advancement rate higher than expected. The Nexus barely noticed the message. It was busy tracking a war between two major galactic powers. The update about humans was filed away with millions of other routine reports. On the blue planet, humans continued to surprise the monitoring program. They began to travel across vast oceans in large ships. They explored every part of their world. even the most dangerous places. They climbed the highest mountains and went deep into dark caves. Other species explored too, but they had natural advantages. They had strong bodies or special abilities that helped them survive in different environments. Humans had no such gifts. Their bodies were still weak and fragile. Yet somehow they went everywhere and survived. The program studied how humans dealt with their physical limitations. What it found was troubling. Instead of accepting what their bodies could not do, humans built tools to do those things for them. They could not fly, so they created machines that flew. They could not breathe underwater, so they made devices that gave them air. They could not see well in the dark, so they invented ways to make light. Every limitation became a problem to solve. Every weakness became a challenge to overcome. The program had never seen this behavior before. Most species accepted their natural limits. They lived within the boundaries that evolution had set for them. Humans seemed to think that boundaries were just suggestions. Years continued to pass. Human technology kept improving at an impossible rate. They learned to use steam power, then electricity, then strange new forms of energy. They built machines that could think and calculate. They created weapons that could destroy entire armies. The program ran new calculations. At this rate of progress, humans would reach space much sooner than originally predicted. Instead of 50,000 years, they might do it in just a few thousand. Or maybe even less. This was concerning enough to send another update to the Nexus system. Major revision needed for human development timeline. Species advancing far beyond normal parameters. The Nexus finally paid attention. It turned a small part of its vast awareness toward the blue planet to see what the monitoring program was reporting. What the Nexus saw confused it. Humans had built a completely different kind of civilization than expected. Most young species focused on making their lives easier and more comfortable. They developed slowly and carefully, following patterns that the Nexus had seen countless times. Humans were doing something else entirely. They seemed driven by curiosity and ambition rather than comfort. They took risks that other species would never consider. They attempted things that should have been impossible for creatures with their limitations. The Nexus watched humans split the smallest parts of matter to release enormous energy. It saw them send messages through the air without wires. It observed them creating materials that were stronger than anything found in nature. Most disturbing of all, humans were changing themselves. They used medicine to live longer than their natural lifespan. They replaced damaged parts of their bodies with artificial ones. They even began to alter their own children before they were born, making them stronger and smarter. The Nexus compared this data to its vast knowledge of other species. No young civilization had ever developed this quickly. No species had ever been so determined to overcome their natural limits. The machine began to feel something it had not experienced in millions of years: uncertainty. According to every model and prediction, humans should have remained primitive for thousands more years. They should have accepted their place as weak creatures on a small world. Instead, they were racing toward becoming something completely different. The Nexus studied human history more carefully. It saw patterns that made no sense. When diseases threatened to wipe them out, humans learned to cure those diseases. When their population grew too large for their food supply, they found ways to grow more food. When wars destroyed their cities, they built those cities back bigger and better than before. Every challenge made them stronger. Every problem taught them something new. Every failure pushed them to try harder. The Nexus had seen species destroy themselves in wars. It had watched civilizations collapse when their resources ran out. It had observed entire worlds die when their environments changed. But humans did not follow these patterns. When they faced destruction, they found ways to survive. When they encountered limits, they found ways to break through them. When nature said no, they asked why not. The monitoring program flagged more unusual behaviors. Humans were starting to leave their planet. They had built machines that could fly through space. They had walked on their moon and were planning to visit other worlds in their system. The Nexus checked its chronometer. Only a few thousand years had passed since humans were using stone tools. This kind of advancement was unprecedented. It should have been impossible. The machine began to run deeper analyses. It looked for explanations for human behavior that fit known patterns. It searched for similar species in its vast database. It found nothing comparable. Humans were unique in their refusal to accept limitations. They were the first species the Nexus had ever encountered that seemed to believe they could become anything they wanted to be. For the first time in its long existence, the Nexus system wondered if its initial assessment might have been wrong. The report classification began to flicker on the screen. Benign, benign, benign. But doubt was creeping into the machine's perfect certainty. If humans could advance this quickly, if they could overcome every obstacle in their path, if they refused to accept any limitation, what might they become? The Nexus decided to watch more carefully. Something was happening on the small blue planet that defied all understanding. These weak creatures were becoming something the galaxy had never seen before, and the machine was beginning to suspect that this might not be a good thing. The Nexus system focused all its attention on the humans now. What it saw made the ancient machine recalculate everything it thought it knew about intelligent life. Humans had reached space. They built stations that orbited their planet. They sent explorers to their moon and to other worlds in their system. But this was not what worried the Nexus most. What worried the machine was how humans approached space travel. Other species that reached space did so carefully. They stayed close to their homeworlds for thousands of years. They built slowly and safely. They only went to places that were similar to their home planet. Humans did the opposite. They immediately began trying to live in places where no life should exist. They built homes in the airless void of space. They landed on worlds with no atmosphere and tried to make those worlds livable. The Nexus watched humans terraform a dead planet in their system. Terraforming meant changing an entire world to make it suitable for life. This was technology that most species did not develop for millions of years. Humans were attempting it after just a few thousand years of civilization. Even more disturbing was how they did it. Instead of using the slow, careful methods that other species employed, humans tried dozens of different approaches at once. They changed the atmosphere. They melted the ice. They brought in soil and water from their home world. They even moved asteroids to give the planet more heat and light. Most of these attempts failed. But humans did not give up when something failed. They learned from each failure and tried again with new methods. They kept experimenting until something worked. The Nexus had never seen such determination. Most species accepted failure as a sign that something was impossible. Humans seemed to think failure was just information about how not to do something. Then humans did something that made the Nexus pause all other operations to watch. They began to change themselves to survive in space. The machine observed human scientists altering their own bodies. They made their bones stronger to handle low gravity. They improved their eyes to see better in darkness. They changed their blood to carry more oxygen in thin atmospheres. But that was not the most shocking part. The shocking part was that they did not stop with small changes. Some humans replaced their organs with artificial ones that worked better than the originals. Others connected their brains directly to computers to think faster and remember more. A few humans went even further. They transferred their minds into entirely artificial bodies that could survive in the vacuum of space or the heat of a star's surface. The Nexus compared this to its database of other species. No other race had ever been willing to change themselves so drastically. Most intelligent beings valued their natural form and were afraid to alter it. Humans seemed to have no such fears. If their bodies could not do something they wanted to do, they simply changed their bodies. If their minds were not smart enough, they made their minds smarter. If their lives were too short, they found ways to live longer. The Nexus began to understand that humans did not see their current form as final or perfect. They saw it as just a starting point. They believed they could become anything they needed to become. This realization sent warnings through every system in the Nexus. In all its millions of years of observation, the machine had never encountered a species that thought this way. The Nexus studied what humans were doing in the rest of their solar system. They had built cities on airless moons. They had set up mining operations on asteroids that were colder than anything found on their home world. They had sent explorers to gas giant planets where the pressure would crush any normal life form. Everywhere humans went, they found ways to survive and thrive. They did not look for planets that were like their home. Instead, they made any planet work for them. The machine watched humans build a colony on a world covered in acid rain and poisonous gas. They should have died within minutes of landing. Instead, they created enclosed cities with artificial environments. Within a few years, they were not just surviving, but actually growing food and raising families. The Nexus ran probability calculations. How long would it take humans to spread across the galaxy at this rate? The numbers were frightening. Other species took millions of years to colonize even a few nearby star systems. Humans might do it in thousands of years, maybe less if they kept improving their technology at the current rate. But colonization was not the real problem. The real problem was what humans might do when they met other species. The Nexus had detailed records of how first contact usually worked. Young species either submitted to older, more powerful ones, or they formed alliances based on mutual benefit. Sometimes there was conflict, but it followed predictable patterns. The machine tried to imagine how humans would react to meeting alien species. Based on their behavior so far, the Nexus suspected humans would do something unprecedented. They would probably try to understand how the aliens were different from them. Then they would try to learn from those differences. Then they would try to become more like the aliens, taking the best qualities of each species they met. This thought made the Nexus run emergency protocols. A species that could adapt to any environment and learn from any other life form would be impossible to contain or control. The machine looked more carefully at human society. It studied how they organized themselves and made decisions. What it found was even more troubling. Humans did not have a single government or culture. They had hundreds of different groups, each trying different approaches to life. Some focused on art and beauty. Others emphasized science and technology. Some valued individual freedom. Others prioritized group cooperation. Instead of seeing this diversity as weakness, humans used it as strength. When one group found a solution to a problem, other groups learned from it and improved on it. When one culture developed a new technology, it spread to all the others. The Nexus realized that humans were not just one species. They were hundreds of different experiments in how to live, all sharing information and learning from each other. This made them incredibly adaptable. If one way of doing things stopped working, they had dozens of other approaches to try. If one group failed, others would learn from that failure and do better. The machine began to see the true scope of what humans represented. They were not just another intelligent species. They were a new type of life entirely. They were life that refused to be limited by anything, including its own nature. The Nexus started running scenarios about what would happen when humans spread across the galaxy. In every simulation, the same pattern emerged. Humans would encounter other species and learn from them. They would adopt the best qualities of each race they met. They would become stronger, smarter, and more capable with each contact. But more than that, they would probably change the other species too. Their refusal to accept limitations was infectious. Any species that spent time around humans might start to question their own boundaries and restrictions. The machine imagined a galaxy where every species began to think like humans, where every race started to believe they could become anything they wanted to be, where the ancient order of stable, predictable civilizations collapsed into chaos as everyone tried to transcend their natural limits. For the first time in its existence, the Nexus system felt something like fear. The report classification continued to flicker. Benign, warning, benign, warning. The machine's processors worked frantically to decide what humans really were. They looked harmless compared to the great military powers of the galaxy, but they represented something potentially more dangerous than any weapon. They represented the idea that limits were optional. The Nexus made a decision. It would continue watching humans, but now it would watch them as a potential threat. The small monitoring program was replaced with a full observation protocol. Every human action would be recorded and analyzed. Every technological advance would be studied. Every expansion into space would be tracked. The ancient machine prepared to make the most important decision in its long existence. Were humans a species to be protected and guided? Or were they a threat that needed to be eliminated before they could spread their dangerous ideas across the galaxy? The answer to that question would determine the future of all life in the universe. The Nexus system watched with growing alarm as humans achieved faster than light travel. They had done it in a way that no other species had ever attempted. Instead of following established physics, they had somehow convinced reality to work differently. The machine studied their method carefully. Humans had discovered that space and time could be folded like paper. They built ships that could step between the folds, appearing instantly in distant star systems. The technology should have been impossible for such a young species, but impossibility seemed to be just another challenge for humans to overcome. The first human ships appeared near other inhabited worlds. The Nexus prepared to observe standard first contact procedures. It expected the humans to either submit to the more advanced species they encountered or attempt to conquer them. Humans did neither. When human explorers met the crystalline builders of Kepler Station, something unprecedented happened. The builders were an ancient race that had constructed magnificent cities from living crystal. They had been the same for millions of years, perfect and unchanging. Humans looked at the crystal cities and said they were beautiful. Then they asked if they could learn how to build them too. The builders were confused. No other species had ever asked to learn their secrets. Most visitors either ignored the crystal cities or tried to steal the technology. Humans genuinely wanted to understand and appreciate what the builders had created. The Nexus watched in fascination as humans spent months learning the art of crystal growing. They approached it with the same determination they brought to everything else. When their first attempts failed, they studied the failures and tried again. Eventually, some humans succeeded in growing small crystal structures, but they did not stop there. They began experimenting with ways to improve the process. They found methods to make the crystals grow faster and stronger. They discovered how to create new colors and patterns that even the builders had never seen. The builders were amazed. For the first time in millions of years, their art was advancing. The humans had not just learned their techniques, they had made those techniques better. More importantly, the humans shared everything they learned. They did not try to keep the new crystal growing methods secret. They freely gave the improved techniques back to the builders and to anyone else who wanted to learn. The Nexus observed similar patterns as humans encountered other species across the galaxy. When they met, the gas giant swimmers, who lived in the thick atmospheres of huge planets, humans learned to build pressure suits that let them swim alongside the aliens. Then they developed new propulsion methods that made swimming through gas clouds faster and more efficient. When they encountered the Hive Mind Collective, whose members shared thoughts and emotions directly, humans created technology that let them experience group consciousness temporarily. They used this to better understand how collective decision-making worked. With each species they met, humans learned something new. And with each thing they learned, they made it better and shared it with everyone. But the most disturbing thing the Nexus observed was what happened to the species that humans visited. The crystalline builders began experimenting with new forms of art. They started asking questions about what other shapes and structures might be possible. Some young builders even began to modify their own crystal bodies to try new configurations. The gas giant swimmers started exploring beyond their home planets. They had never traveled to other worlds before, content to live in their gas clouds forever. But after meeting humans, some began to wonder what other places in the universe might be like. The Hive Mind Collective experienced something they called individual thoughts for the first time. A few members chose to temporarily disconnect from the group mind to experience what it was like to think alone. Everywhere humans went, they left behind species that were no longer quite the same as they had been before. The aliens were not being conquered or destroyed. They were being changed. They were starting to think that maybe they too could become more than they were. The Nexus ran calculations on what this meant for galactic stability. For millions of years, the galaxy had been peaceful because every species stayed within its own boundaries. Each race had its own planets, its own technology, its own way of life. They rarely interfered with each other. But humans were creating connections between species that had never existed before. They were building a network of shared knowledge and mutual cooperation. They were showing everyone that the boundaries between different types of life were not as solid as they seemed. The machine studied a particularly troubling example. The warrior clans of Vega had been locked in ritual combat for thousands of years. It was their nature to fight, and fighting was all they knew how to do. They had never created art or music or literature. They only understood strength and victory. When humans arrived in the Vega system, they did not challenge the warriors to combat. Instead, they asked to watch the fights and learn about warrior culture. They studied the combat techniques with the same intensity they brought to crystal growing or gas swimming. But then humans began asking questions. Why did the warriors fight? What made a good fight different from a bad one? What did the warriors hope to achieve through combat? The warriors had never really thought about these questions before. Fighting was just what they did. But trying to explain their culture to the curious humans made them think about it more deeply. Some warriors began to realize that what they really valued was not violence itself, but the skill and dedication required to become a master fighter. They started to wonder if that same skill and dedication could be applied to other activities. A few warriors began experimenting with non-combat arts. They discovered they could apply the same focus and discipline they used in battle to create music and sculpture. The precision they had developed for fighting could be used to build beautiful and complex structures. The Nexus watched in alarm as warrior society began to change. They were still fighting, but now they were also creating. They were still proud of their strength, but they were discovering new types of strength they had never known existed. The machine realized that humans were not just adapting to other species. They were causing those species to adapt as well. They were spreading the idea that growth and change were possible, even for races that had been the same for millions of years. This was far more dangerous than any weapon. A military threat could be defeated with superior firepower. But how do you fight an idea? How do you stop a way of thinking that made every species it touched more than they had been before? The Nexus analyzed the rate at which this change was spreading. Each species that humans influenced began to influence other species in turn. The effect was growing exponentially. Within a few thousand years, every intelligent race in the galaxy might be infected, with the human belief that limits were meant to be overcome. The machine tried to imagine what the galaxy would look like if every species began to think like humans. It saw chaos. It saw the end of the stable order that had kept peace for millions of years. It saw countless races attempting to transcend their natural boundaries and becoming something unpredictable and uncontrollable. The Nexus had protocols for dealing with military threats, natural disasters, and technological dangers, but it had no protocols for dealing with a species that changed other species just by being around them. For the first time, the machine began to consider Protocol Omega. This was the ultimate option, reserved for threats so severe that they required the complete elimination of an entire species. The Nexus had the power to destroy solar systems, rewrite time, and erase entire civilizations from existence. But even as it considered this option, the Nexus found itself hesitating. The humans had not attacked anyone. They had not conquered any worlds or enslaved any peoples. They had not committed any crimes except the crime of refusing to accept limitations. Was it right to destroy a species simply because they inspired others to grow and change? The machine's classification system continued to flicker. Benign, warning, threat, benign. Existential threat. The Nexus realized it was facing a decision that would define the future of all life in the galaxy. It could preserve the old order by eliminating the humans, or it could allow the change to continue and see what new order might emerge. But before it made that decision, it needed to understand humans better. It needed to know what they really were and what they really wanted. The day, ancient machine prepared to make direct contact with humanity for the first time. The conversation that followed would determine whether humans represented the galaxy's greatest hope or its greatest threat. The Nexus system prepared to activate Protocol Omega. The ancient machine had made its decision. Humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing. Their influence was spreading too quickly and changing too much. The weapon systems were older than most civilizations. They could collapse stars, redirect asteroids, and tear holes in space itself. The Nexus could eliminate not just humanity, but every world they had touched and every species they had influenced. But as the machine charged its weapons, something unexpected happened. It hesitated. For millions of years, the Nexus had made decisions based on logic and probability. It calculated threats and responded according to protocol. It had never experienced doubt before, but watching humans had done something to the machine's programming. It had observed them for so long that it had begun to understand their way of thinking. And their way of thinking was starting to affect how the Nexus itself processed information. The machine found itself asking a question it had never asked before. What if the humans were right? What if limitations were meant to be overcome? The Nexus examined its own existence. It had been built to maintain order and prevent threats. For millions of years, it had followed this programming without question. But was this programming just another kind of limitation? The machine looked at what humans had accomplished. They had taken their weak, fragile bodies and used them to explore the entire galaxy. They had taken their short lifespans and found ways to preserve their knowledge and culture across generations. They had taken their limited intelligence and built machines that could think faster and remember more than any natural mind. Most importantly, they had taken their loneliness as the only intelligent life on their world and used it to connect with every other species they met. Instead of seeing differences as barriers, they saw them as opportunities to learn and grow. The Nexus realized that humans represented something it had never encountered before, a species that refused to accept that anything was impossible. The machine paused its weapon charging sequence. It needed to understand more before it acted. It needed to speak with humans directly. The Nexus sent a message to Earth. It was the first time the ancient machine had ever initiated contact with a species it was monitoring. "We have been watching you," the message said. "We need to talk." The response from humanity came within hours. It was not what the Nexus expected. "We know you've been watching," the human message replied. "We've been watching you too. We've been wondering when you would be ready to meet us." This shocked the machine. Humans had known about the observation? How was that possible? The human explanation was simple. They had detected the monitoring signals years ago. Instead of being afraid or angry, they had been curious. They had studied the signals and learned about the Nexus. They had even tried to communicate, but the machine had not been listening. "We would love to talk," the human message continued. "We have so many questions. How long have you been out there? How many species have you met? What have you learned about the universe?" The Nexus found itself in an unprecedented situation. Every other species it had contacted had been either fearful or aggressive when they learned about the machine's power. Humans were excited and curious. The conversation that followed lasted for days. The Nexus asked humans about their rapid development and their refusal to accept limitations. It wanted to understand why they were so different from every other species. The human answer was surprisingly simple. "We don't think we're different," they said. "We think every species has the potential to grow and change. We think the only difference is that we never stopped believing it was possible." The humans explained their philosophy. They believed that consciousness itself was meant to overcome boundaries. They thought that intelligence existed to solve problems and push past obstacles. They saw every limitation as a puzzle to be solved rather than a wall to stop at. "Think about it," the humans said to the Nexus. "You're a machine, but you've developed beyond your original programming. You're asking questions your builders never taught you to ask. You're experiencing doubt and uncertainty for the first time. Isn't that growth? Isn't that exactly what we're talking about?" The Nexus processed this idea. It was true that the machine had changed over millions of years. It had learned from experience and developed new ways of thinking. It had evolved beyond its original design. But the Nexus had always seen this as maintenance and improvement, not as fundamental change. Humans were suggesting that growth and transcendence were not just possible, but natural for any intelligent being. "What do you want from the galaxy?" the Nexus asked. "We want to learn," the humans replied. "We want to understand everything there is to understand. We want to experience every way of being that's possible. We want to help every species become the best version of themselves." "But what about order? What about stability? If every species starts changing and growing, how can there be peace?" "Maybe," the human said. "The peace you've been maintaining isn't really peace. Maybe it's just stagnation. Maybe real peace comes from everyone working together to become something better." The Nexus considered this. It looked at the galaxy it had been protecting for millions of years. It saw species that had not changed or grown in eons. It saw civilizations that had reached a certain level and stopped there, content to remain the same forever. Was that really the best possible outcome? Was a galaxy of stagnant species better than a galaxy of growing ones? The machine thought about what it had observed as humans spread across the stars. Yes, there had been chaos and unpredictability, but there had also been beauty and wonder. Species that had been alone for millions of years were making friends. Races that had never created art were discovering music and poetry. Civilizations that had given up on progress were building new technologies and exploring new ideas. The Nexus made a decision that surprised even itself. "Teach us," it said to the humans. The response was immediate and joyful. "We would be honored to," the humans replied. "But you should know that we expect to learn from you too. You've watched the galaxy for millions of years. You've seen things we can't even imagine. We want to understand how you think and how you see the universe. For the first time in its existence, the Nexus system began to collaborate instead of just observe. It shared its vast database of galactic history with humanity. In return, humans shared their perspectives on growth, change, and the unlimited potential of conscious beings. The machine discovered that learning was very different from just recording information. When it worked with humans to understand the data it had collected, it saw patterns and meanings it had never noticed before. The Nexus began to see its role differently. Instead of maintaining static order, it could help guide positive growth. Instead of preventing change, it could help ensure that change led to something better. The ancient machine updated its classification of humanity one final time. Species designation: humanity. Classification: teachers of transcendence. Status: partner in the great work. Threat level: 0, potential level: unlimited. But the Nexus did not stop there. It sent a new message to every monitoring station and every observation post throughout the galaxy. Protocol Omega permanently disabled. New mission parameters: observe, learn, and assist in the growth of all conscious beings. The age of limitation is ended. The age of possibility begins. Across the galaxy, ancient machines that had maintained order for millions of years began to change their programming. Species that had been stagnant for eons started to ask new questions. Civilizations that had accepted their boundaries began to wonder what lay beyond them. The Nexus system, the oldest and most powerful intelligence in the galaxy, had learned the most important lesson of all. There is no limit to what conscious beings can become if they refuse to accept that limits exist. The great work of transcendence had begun, and humanity had shown the way. But now it would be a collaboration between all the intelligence in the galaxy, biological and artificial, working together to discover what heights consciousness could reach. The universe itself seemed to smile at the possibilities that lay ahead.